Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC Upper Bracket Round 1 and 2 overview and analysis video in the spring playoffs. It's finally time to jump into the best of fives here in the LEC, and we do it with a bit of a different format than we normally do. Of course, I think a lot of LEC fans have gotten used to the 3-split format, more so than a lot of the other regions, but we're switching things up in terms of how playoffs are taking place in the LEC this split, with it going to much more of a standard, double elimination playoff bracket where the top 4 teams are slotted into upper bracket 5 and 6, immediately slotted into lower bracket, and the top 2 teams that make the finals end up going to MSI. So a lot on the line here today. Not only are we going to know our teams that drop into the lower bracket utilize their extra life in round number 1, but winners finals took place last weekend in the first weekend of the playoffs. So we're actually going to know our first team to officially qualify for MSI and for the finals as well. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below what you thought of these games, what you thought of these teams, whether or not they surprised you or kind of lived up to your expectations. I'm curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into everything. Let's go ahead and jump into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we will be talking about the updated bracket. Of course, like I said, we will know our semifinals participant in the team that loses winners finals, our first finals participant, and all of our matchups for this next weekend in the lower bracket. So we'll kind of preview all of that at the end of the video, but most of today will be spent talking about the 3 series we got this previous weekend. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the analysis itself, and that of course is going to kick off with our biggest rivalry here in Europe. It's a very apropos way to kick off the playoffs, as we had the number 2 seeded Fnatic taking on the number 4 seeded G2 Esports, and G2 is going to pick up the 3-1 series win. They are going to go to 4 games, but they are going to win the series, and honestly, this is kind of what we all expected. I didn't pick Fnatic in this series. I know a lot of people did not pick Fnatic in this series. This is just what happens to Fnatic in best of fives. They look horrible in these big matchups against these big teams, and G2 always seems to be able to figure it out as they go further and further along into the playoffs, and that's exactly what happened here. One little thing I want to point out, shout out my editor, Izzy. He's been with the channel for quite a while. You guys see him in the comments section. He sometimes leaves little notes that he wants to kind of throw in some of these pages when he helps make them, some of the graphics that go up on the screen. Sometimes I leave them in, sometimes I delete them, but he's a huge Fnatic fan, and so I figured it was only right, it felt only correct to leave in the little note here. Fnatic are 2-8 in a playoff series versus G2 during the Razork and Humanoid era, and both of their wins came in non-elimination matches. That's how dominant this has been for G2. This has stopped really being like a rivalry in the same kind of way, because Fnatic has just not been able to overcome G2 ever when it's really mattered, and I think that once again showed up here. They played awful in this series. A couple of things that I think they did really poorly, a couple of things I think they did fine, and generally, some grace I'm willing to give them in a couple of different areas, but G2 was just better across the map in a couple of very specific areas, but definitely better. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Hansama is going to be my player of the series here. Best of 5 Hansama has returned. This is generally what he does every single split in the domestic playoffs. Is he's totally fine in the regular season. He's like the 3rd or 4th best AD carry. He's the best AD carry in the entire league when you get to these domestic best of 5 playoffs, and then he goes international and he doesn't play particularly well. That's always been kind of the scouting report on Hansama, is that these games, these best of 5s against Fnatic and against Corp and against KOI and like all these other, top tier LEC teams, like they're his best games, and that has very much continued to stay true in this series at the very least, where he dominated down the stretch. I think specifically you can look at games 3 and 4 with him really taking over both. Game 4 on the Kai'Sa was awesome from him, and I think it's really encouraging to see him be able to play something like Kai'Sa into Tristana, where you do need to play a little bit safer in the early game, kind of allow yourself to get online a little bit more, allow the Galio and the Trundle to be able to facilitate you a tad bit more and still be able to be successful in that role. Hansama is a player who, I don't want to sit here and trash him too much, because I feel like people think I'm a Hansama hater, and I guess I kind of am. I just don't think he's like an A minus graded player. I think he's the definition of a B plus player at this level, somebody who's going to be super consistent for you. You know what you're going to get, split by split. You can generally expect, maybe not on a game-to-game basis, but overall what you're going to get output-wise from a player like Hansama, but he's going to do it in a way that's pretty one-dimensional. He's a very good laner, and he's a very good skirmisher. He's not always the most consistent late-game team fighter in the entire world. Luckily for the team, they put a lot of eggs in his basket, and he was able to make make it worth it at the end of game number 4, specifically on the Kai'Sa, but you know, it's just nice to see him step up once again. We already talked about it a bit, but he really is a playoff performer, at least domestically, even if those international performances don't necessarily back that up. And him being better than Upset in this series, or at least getting more resources than Upset in this series, was a pretty big deal for G2. Everybody got mad at me that I did not give Upset my All-Pro nod. I gave it to Kaliste over Upset. You know, Upset's good, but I just don't know if, you know, if Kaliste was on this team, would he have done just as well? Probably, right? Kaliste's role on K-Corp was a little bit more relevant than I think Upset's on Fnatic, because Upset was mostly just getting every resource that this team had to offer. That's just my personal opinion. We'll go ahead and talk about that a bit more as we go over to Fnatic, but with Hans playing a lot more of the scalers and actually finding success, I think that's a really good sign. I also do want to give a really big shout out to Labrov. I know the scoreline, the KDA, might not make it seem like he was the most relevant player in this entire series, but there were a couple of games that he just instantly won for G2, specifically game number 2 on the Nautilus, where it felt like he was actually cheating with those hooks. It was unbelievable how accurate he was throughout the entirety of game 2. He still was really good in games 3 and 4, specifically in game 4 on the Leona to set things up. I think the bot lane really stepped up here today and kind of just outclassed Fnatic's bot lane. That's not to say that Upset and Mickey were the problem, because they absolutely were not, but Upset and Mickey were probably the best members of Fnatic, and they were not the better bot lane in this series, and I do think that that matters quite a bit in terms of the narrative. I do want to shout out Caps as well. The scoreline for him also not looking quite as, you know, phenomenal, but most of that is going to come from his awful game number 1 on the Akali that ended up really being a problem for G2. Of course, G2 kind of doing the traditional G2 thing, which is losing game 1 and then sweeping the rest of the series. I can't even count on one hand the amount of times that they've done this over the past 2 years, because it's genuinely absurd how consistent this pattern in particular is. But Caps kind of running it on Akali into game 1, you know, picking it blind, and then, I guess not blind, but picking it and then allowing Razork to take Vi on the other side and completely shut down everything he wants to do is very funny. But he was awesome in game 2 on the Ahri, and I do think he was getting better throughout the rest of the series. The Galio was nice in game 4. The Annie had a really slow start in game 3, but ended up being relevant as the game continued to go on, as Annie tends to do. So credit to Caps there. Broken Blade was definitely the better top laner in this series. I have not been impressed at all with Broken Blade in 2025. I do not think he's played well so far this year, so it's nice to see him step up and just be better than Oscar Rinnan on the other side. And Skewmond was pretty consistent as an enabler, really didn't make any mistakes throughout this series, was just kind of along for the ride and allowed his carries to be able to carry the game. That's all you can ask for from a rookie jungler in a big situation. So nice for G2, nice win for G2. They move on to winners finals. We'll talk about them a bit more later on in the video, but for Fnatic on the other side, you know, some pluses and some minuses. I think some people might look at some of these KDAs and feel okay about a couple of these players. Some of these are a lie and some of these aren't. I think the lies in a positive direction are that, you know, Mickey X was probably the best player for Fnatic in this series. The amount that he was able to create for that team was absolutely astounding, and I think generally the Rel single-handedly won them game number 1. Maybe not single-handedly. That feels a bit, you know, a bit like a BM to Humanoid, who actually played pretty well on the Azir, but the Rel was awesome in game number 1. The Taric was honestly super relevant in game number 3. It just did not matter because there wasn't enough damage coming in from the side of Fnatic to actually win any of those fights, but the Taric was actually really big in that 3rd game, and, you know, a lot of great pop blossoms in game 4 that just came a little too late for Fnatic. They just weren't able to actually capitalize on that, and every engage kind of sunk them a bit deeper, even if it's not necessarily the fault of Mickey X. So I do want to give a shout out to him. He was probably the best player on the team in this series. Upset also was generally fine. Hansama was certainly better, but he also got way more resources, and AD carry is just one of those roles where if you're behind in resources, it's hard to be as relevant. That's where I can start talking about the solo laners. Humanoid was really good in game number 1 on the Azir, and you can look at the score lines and you can see him being relevant in game 3 and game 4, and, you know, kind of being the one to push the team forward. And I agree that he was kind of the centralizing force for what Fnatic wanted to do in a lot of these games. The problem is I don't think his individual play necessarily lived up to that. He definitely got outplayed in game 2. The Taliyah game was easily his worst of the entire series, and honestly, I would say he got outplayed in game 4, even if he did have a lot of gold, and even if he wasn't really making a ton of mistakes. Caps was so much more active throughout that entire game that honestly it became very difficult for Fnatic to be able to keep up in terms of pressure, and I do think that that was a very big deal. So Humanoid generally KDA-wise was fine, but maybe not so much in terms of pressure. And then Oscar Rinnan is the easy choice for dead of the series. Dude completely sold it down the stretch. Like, he was bad in every single one of their losses, but specifically in games 3 and 4, where he just was not useful in any way. The Yorick was entirely useless, but generally I think that champion is useless unless your team is super far ahead or way better than the team you're playing into. I advise people against playing Yorick because nobody seems to know how to play it correctly right now. But game 3 on the Gwen, he actually did have a bit of gold, and he was constantly out of position and dying first in team fights, and that's completely unacceptable for a comp that really needs needs Gwen damage in order to be relevant, and then he was horrendous on the Camille. Like, truly, probably the worst game of the entire series from anybody across this entire, 4-game stretch. Maybe Caps' game 1 on the Akali was slightly worse, but Oscar Renan was just miserable. This is one of the worst best of 5s he's ever played, and I think it's really unfortunate because people are finally starting to come around on the upside and the consistency that Oscar has been offering across this year, me included. I've been kind of an Oscar doubter for a long time. I've not really put him in the top 3 or 4 top laners, and, this year he's definitely been a top 3 top laner in terms of just raw production and execution, but it's these big moments that concern me. It's these big moments where he's not able to step up and be consistent that make me think, okay, is this guy really like an elite top laner, or is he just really good at beating players that he's way better than? That still remains to be determined because he did not show up here today. So kind of a frustrating loss for Fnatic. They're going to move down to the lower part of the bracket. They're going to have to come back next week and look a little bit better, but no surprise here. G2 has always had Fnatic's number, as we can see from those statistics, and once again, G2 is able to pull through. We'll talk about them a bit more because they play the winner of the series we're going to talk about next in winners finals, but this team is now just one best of 5 away from international qualification again, regardless of how up and down their regular season was, and this just seems to be the pathway that the Kings of Europe take in order to be even just a tad bit more dominant than everybody else. Then moving on to our second of the first round series here, and this was the one where, despite the first series having a lower seed winning, I think we saw it coming. This one was a true upset for me. It was the number 1 seeded Corp taking on the number 3 seeded Movistar KOI, and KOI picks up the 3-2 victory. It goes all 5 games. It goes the distance, and KOI is able to survive that, really kind of keep their wits about them by being the more dominant team in this series and come out on top. It didn't really matter that through the first 4 games, it felt pretty clear that KOI was better. All that mattered is that they came out in game number 5 and proved it, and that's exactly what they did here. Some fantastic performances from players on the side of KOI, but more importantly, what happened to Corp in this series mentally? Because there are some very clear signs of mental boom coming in from this team. I just don't think they expected to come in and lose these games. I think that they were confident that they were going to dominate Movistar KOI, that they were going to beat them pretty consistently like they have all year long. That was not the case. They were not the better team here today, and you could see that on the Rift. You have things like Kalist rage quitting in game number 3, as they're, pushing down the base. He's going to get fined for that. I believe that that's not allowed. You have, Yike coming out in pre-game interviews talking about how nobody can beat them, that they're the, by far the favorites to come in and destroy the entire playoffs. Like, everything just kind of collapsing. Vladdy showing no respect to Jojo Pume in terms of how he plays out these laning phases. Like, this was a bad performance from Corp. This didn't look like a competitive team at the top of the standings, and they're going to have to change some things in order to, really kind of reestablish themselves, and, we'll talk about that. But for KOI, man, there are a couple of players that I really want to point out. First and foremost, Supa's player of the series. You don't really need to kind of, deliberate on this. This is a very obvious choice for anybody who watched these games. He decimated game number 5 on the Tristana, absolutely blew that game wide open, and he was excellent in the other wins as well, on the Xayah in game 1, on the Senna in game number 3. He still was super consistent on the Kai'Sa and the Lucian, even in their losses. He was never the problem. He's just a really, really good player, and I know I'm a Supa defender. Like, as much as I can talk about how I've kind of been a hater of a couple of other players, that we've talked about previously, I am a big Supa, glazer, or at least I was last year. I was putting him as a top 1, top 2 AD carry coming into this year, and, I gave him my rookie of the year last year because, quite frankly, it was insane that Jackie's won it after being as bad as he was in the spring split. People just looked at the summer split, and, I continued to kind of pound the table and say Supa and Alvaro were one of the best bot lanes in Europe in 2024, and you know what? All they've done this year is kind of prove that that's correct, because they've been unbelievably stable, unbelievably consistent. They've never been the problem for this team, and they have continued to push them forward as long as they're able to get the resources that they need in order to do so. Honestly, the bot lane I compare them to, and I don't know if people are going to see this as generous or, maybe this bot lane is not good enough to be compared to Supa and Alvaro. I think both honestly could be, considered accurate, is Sven and Vulcan for Cloud9 over in North America right now, where you just kind of know what you're going to get out of them from a game-to-game basis. They play relatively similarly, where the support is very active and very aggressive as a primary playmaker for the team, and the AD carry is just kind of along for the ride. You're going to have some big pop-off performances because their mechanics are super sound, and I would argue Supa is a better AD carry than Sven, but I do think that they fill similar roles, and that consistency is a really big positive. So credit to Supa. I've always been on the Supa and Alvaro train. I've consistently put them as one of the best bot lanes in Europe, and I think they consistently prove me right. Basically, every single time they have to, It's cool to see this team actually focus in on Supa as a primary carry, which they haven't done much this year. It's something I've criticized them for. But Jojo Pune also was really great in this series, and I don't know if that shows up in the KDA. 15, 17, and 50 is a really, really good KDA, but he had a couple of games where he just absolutely blew this series wide open, specifically the Ahri in game number 1. That might be the single best game of the entire series from anybody. He really played that about as well as you possibly could. And then the Rise in game 5 was also really great from him. He just did an awesome job at being able to force K-Corp off of their comfort zone, like taking a lot of these skirmishes and making sure that they didn't feel comfortable positioning anywhere on the map. That's what he does at a really high level. And one of the things I've criticized KOI for, and one of the reasons I didn't think they were going to be as successful in the best of 5s, is because I'm concerned that if Jojo Pune doesn't win in the mid lane, if he's not able to get a bunch of pressure there, that this team is not going to be able to, play through anybody else. Not that Supa or Elyoya or Mirwin can't carry games. They absolutely can, but this team hasn't shown the ability to play through those players as much as they've shown the ability to play through Jojo when he doesn't have resources. And it's nice to see that he can still show up in these big moments. And, I got a lot of criticism for putting Jojo as my all-pro pick over Vladi. People thought that that was an insane thing to do. I think Jojo added more wins to KOI than Vladi added to K-Corp, who, Vladi was much more of a secondary player for that team. Again, I'm not saying Jojo's a better player than Vladi. What I'm saying is that Vladi wasn't quite as important towards K-Corp's success. And honestly, Jojo outplayed Vladi all day here today. Even if you kind of look at that game number, game number 4 on the Aurora, where he played really poor and, Vladi had a bit of resources on the Hwei. That's like the only game you can point to where it really felt like Vladi was significantly better than Jojo on the other side. So credit to Jojo. I thought he really stepped up here today. Elyoya was definitely the better jungler in this series, and it wasn't even really all that close. An absolute decimation, in my opinion, coming in from him. Yike had a really bad series, especially in the bookend games of 1 and 5, and Elyoya really tore him apart in that regard. Mirwin was, decently solid in their wins, not so much in their losses, and so it's a little bit difficult for me to sit here and be like, oh, he had a great series, because his, game 3 on the Nidalee was, exactly what Nidalee is supposed to be. And his game 5 on the Ornn was really consistent, but his game 4 on the Scion was miserably bad, and he had a really weird build, and it's hard to, fully commit to that. Alvaro, as I already talked about, I didn't really bring him up in particular, but he was exceptionally good. The bot lane in general was exceptionally good for KOI. Way better than K-Corp's bot lane on the other side. Like, Supa just outplayed Kaliste, and Alvaro just outplayed Targamas, and everything just kind of clicked into place. So credit to KOI. They really stepped up here today. This is a big upset, in my opinion, one I did not see coming, but I am pretty excited about it because it means that there's another contender in the race here in the LEC. But for K-Corp on the other side, you've got a lot to fix. There are multiple players on this team that I think just played bad, like straight up bad here today. I think specifically the middle 3 members, Yike, Vladi, and Kaliste, did not really do much here today, and there is a lot to criticize about their performances. Yike is going to get dud of the series for me, mostly for game 1 on the Xin Zhao, where he just was unplayable. Probably the worst game of the entire series. If Jojo's game 1 was dominant, Yike's game 1 was completely unplayable. And then Yike was also quite bad in game 5 on the Wukong. Again, the bookend games were just not good at all from Yike, and he needs to step up. Again, he had the funny interview comment where he was like, there's no team that can compete with us in the playoffs, and then obviously they immediately lose to KOI because that's just how things go around here. But it's clear he was not prepared to go into the aggression that KOI was willing to offer, a lot of the mid-game skirmishing that KOI was willing to do, and he didn't really have an answer to it. He kind of failed in a lot of these fights, and I think you could say the same thing for the carry duo of Vladi and Kaliste. Kaliste's KDA looks fine. Generally, Vladi's KDA also kind of looks fine, but Vladi was completely inactive in this series. Jojo had all of the tempo and all of the pressure with the exception of game number 4, but specifically in games 1 and 5, and really game 3 as well. Jojo kind of got to do whatever he wanted on the map because he was constantly pushing forward, and Vladi was just more of a reactionary piece. I was not impressed with how he played out a lot of these games. It felt very greedy how he played a lot of the early games in this series, and he got punished pretty hard for it. And then Kaliste just made some boneheaded mistakes down the stretch of these games. Obviously, game 3 was not ideal for him. The rage quit is what people are going to talk about, but he stepped up at the end of game number 5 and got caught, and that's really what sealed the deal for K-Corp and kind of put the nail in the coffin. At that point, the game was completely over, and you just can't really make those mistakes in the playoffs. And I get that this team is young, and you have a lot of players here that are used to winning. Kaliste has never lost to Split in the LEC, or whatever narrative you want to try and spin here, but you got to keep your head on, and you got to stay locked in a series like this, and it did not feel like that was the case for K-Corp. I think Targamas was generally fine. His KDA is probably a bit worse than maybe his gameplay would indicate. I don't think he was the problem here. Kana mega carried their wins in this series. He was incredible in game 2 on the Mbessa, basically 1v9'd that game. They were losing every single team fight until the Mbessa showed up, and then they were winning every single team fight, and then he also hard carried game number 4, where he was excellent on the Camille. But he did get pretty heavily outplayed in the games that they lost. He was pretty bad in game 3. He was pretty bad in game 5. And so, I'm not blaming Kana. He's been the best player on this team. He was my MVP pick for the regular season, for a reason. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that Kana was the problem. In fact, he was the only one trying to find a solution in this series, but it just wasn't enough. K-Corp is going to fall down to the lower bracket, and now they have a much harder road ahead of them. Remember, the difference between winning this series, just alone, like winning this game 5, is having to play 2 extra best of 5s to even try and make it to where you would make it if you lost winners finals. That's a crazy difference. And so K-Corp definitely going to have to put their mental pants back on. They're going to have to lock in order to get back to where they want to be. But for KOI, really big win for them. They move on to winners finals. We'll talk about that in a second when they take on G2. But the fact that they're guaranteed top 3 no matter what throughout the rest of this split is already such an accomplishment for them. But that's going to bring us now to our winners finals overview. And I'm excited to get into this because it's crazy that we're getting this on the first weekend. The LEC always does this. They rush the upper bracket and they give a lot of time for whoever wins this series to sit and wallow and wait for their finals appearance. They're going to have to wait basically 2 whole weekends to play again after this, but still getting there would guarantee a spot at MSI. So both of these teams really want to do it. It's the number 3 seeded Movistar KOI taking on the number 4 seeded G2 Esports. And G2 is going to pick up the 3-1 series victory. They're going to be moving on to the LEC Spring Split Finals, and they will also be the first team globally to officially qualify for the 2025 Mid-Season Invitational. Congratulations to G2. I don't think anybody's particularly surprised by this outcome. This team is insane when they actually play their own style. They have some flaws. They have some things that they're really not particularly good at, but at the end of the day, when you've got the best player in the region and when he steps up and plays the way that he can, that's the difference maker. Caps is so much better than everybody else in Europe when he actually plays like himself, when he plays like a carry, when he plays like he knows he's the best player in Europe, when he goes out there and dominates, he's the best player, and it's not close, and he puts his team over the edge all the time. He is the difference between G2 being around the same level as Fnatic and KOI and K-Corp and all these other teams that are good, but maybe not like perfect, like, don't have a ton of like, guaranteed success. That's the difference between being that and being what G2 have been over the past couple of years, which is unstoppable at the top of the LEC. That's what Caps creates individually himself, and he continues to do it here where he just dominated this series. All 3 of their wins, you can kind of point to Caps in a lot of different ways for being the primary option, specifically games 1 and 4, where I think he really pushed his team forward. The Ahri was unbelievable in game 1, and the Tristana just got reset after reset after reset, dominated those team fights at the end of game number 4 as well. Even really the mid-game skirmishes in game 4, everything just kind of going the way of G2. For KOI on the other side, still some positives to take away from this. I think that there were a couple of performances that were okay, all things considered. Jojo, Alvaro, I think were generally fine. Supa wasn't necessarily the problem, but at the end of the day, if you're not going to have the same kind of agency as your opponent on the other side of the matchup, things are definitely going to get a lot more difficult for KOI. So we'll talk about that. But player of the series for me is going to go to Caps in the mid lane. Come on, man. Like, unreal series from him. I've already kind of talked about it. The Ahri in game 1 completely blew open this series for G2. Kind of made it difficult for KOI to find their footing, even going into that second game, because Caps was such a scary threat, and you kind of knew that he was going to step up and win a lot of these skirmishes for the team. If that was going to be the case, it's difficult to imagine a world where this team wanted to go out and fight. And so honestly, it kind of influenced KOI to be a lot more passive throughout the rest of the series, which they were. They were pretty passive throughout a lot of these games. And I think Caps' dominance in game number 1 was a pretty big reason for that, but it's mostly game number 4 that he's really getting this for. I mean, Claps was very much in full effect here. Jojo put up a pretty good fight on the other side of this. He had some bad plays, but he had some phenomenal plays for KOI as well. He tried his best to drag this team back in. I'm not blaming Jojo for allowing Caps to dominate, but Caps very much was the best player on the Rift, and it was not particularly close. A couple of other players to point out, Broken Blade, I think, generally had a pretty good series, was definitely the better top laner, and we'll talk about that with Mirwin. On the other side, Skewmond was probably the second best player on the team in this series. Nice to see that, considering he was a player that was good as a facilitator in their first series against Fnatic, but wasn't really like a primary option, and didn't really play all that well in the finals against K-Corp the first time, these teams ended up, getting a bit of best of 5, like, playoff action, and so it's nice to see him step up against Elyoya, completely out-jungle him in terms of the tempo that he was able to create, and even carry a game in game number 2 on that Nefiri. I would definitely argue that he was the primary option there. Hansama and Labrov were just as good as they were previously in that last series against Fnatic. Maybe not quite as dominant. Hansama didn't get as many resources, but they gave him his signature Draven in a do-or-die game number 4, and they even gave Labrov Blitzcrank, which is one of his better picks as well, if not his best champion, and so just ended up being kind of a disaster for KOI. G2 got everything that they were looking for. Collapse was in full effect and everything kind of went their way. And then for KOI on the other side, again, some pluses and minuses. I don't want to make it out to seem like they just got completely rolled over in this series. Game 3 was a good win, even if it did need to be a come-from-behind win for them. Game 2 was also a pretty decent game, all things considered, for KOI. They just kind of got blown out in Game 4, and that's really going to kind of change people's reputation and kind of remembrance of what happened in this series. But Elyoya is going to be my choice for dead of the series. I think a lot of people are going to point to Mirwin or even Jojo Pyun for some of his negative plays and kind of talk about them as dead of the series. For me, Elyoya losing pressure and never really being relevant at all in any of these games was the biggest problem for KOI. I think Skewmon had all the tempo in the world, especially in the back half of the series. Not only was Game 2 a huge problem, the Ivern was almost non-existent for Elyoya, which is a problem. That champion is always busted when it comes out in Europe, but the Maokai was a huge issue in game number 4 in terms of just facilitating and setting up the team, and the Sejuani was just a complete no-show. Like, Elyoya did not show up here today, and I think that that was a pretty big problem for KOI. I think you could theoretically give this to Mirwin on the top side because his bad games were also quite bad, specifically Game 2 on the Jace, where he just looked awful, like got completely outplayed by Broken Blade, was separated from every single fight. The Scion was never really able to be broken, and so Mirwin ended up being kind of useless there, but the Cassante just getting bursted in every single team fight, dying almost instantly, was also not really an ideal set of circumstances for Mirwin. Outside of that, though, I think this team was generally fine. Again, Jojo had a couple of really bad plays, especially early on in Game 3, which is ironic because that's the game they won, but he's also the reason they won that game with a couple of team fight moments on the Yone. He was really good in Game 2 on the Azir. It just didn't really end up mattering, and I don't think he was the problem on the Rise or the Victor, even if he was outclassed in Games 1 and 4 by Caps. On the other side, Alvaro tried his best to win Game number 1 solo on the Rel. I mean, people are going to point to that gigantic 3-man engage that he had, but he had multiple plays throughout that game that almost single-handedly won it for KOI. He was excellent here. Supa wasn't really the problem, although he also wasn't really the solution in terms of the things he was creating for the team. I think he was generally fine, all things considered, but maybe I want to see him be a bit more aggressive, especially because he did just carry this team in the previous series. This is the problem that KOI ran into. If Jojo is not actively winning them games, if Elyoya doesn't have a ton of pressure, if the middle of the map is not thriving, I have a hard time believing that KOI is actually going to be able to take down top-tier teams, even if I think they have the talent elsewhere on the roster to be able to do that. Supa and Alvaro can carry games, can be primary options, but it's clear that when this team is playing from a neutral state, they don't necessarily want to go towards it, and I think it hurts their upside. But for G2, this is a huge win. Not only does it obviously put them in the LEC finals, get them closer to another trophy that they desperately missed having in the winter split, but it gets them to another international tournament and gives them a chance to kind of right the wrongs that they had earlier on this year. It's a big, big win for G2, and I think they're going to be happy to move forward with it. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC upper bracket round number 1 and 2 overview and analysis video. You can see up on the screen, not only do we have our, first finals participant here in the LEC, but as we said before, the first team to qualify for MSI, G2 Esports, the first team globally. No other team has, even gotten far enough in their playoffs to come close to qualifying for MSI. That's how fast the LEC is going right now, but congrats to G2. We'll see if they can carry that momentum forward into the finals, go in as the number 1 seed, because remember, the number 1 seed auto-qualifies for the main stage. The number 2 seed will have to go in through the play-in stage, where 2 teams will be eliminated. So it is pretty positive to actually win your league rather than just being a team that, gets in as the number 2 seed. You have a lot more safety in that regard to play a lot more games against top-tier teams. So we'll see what happens with G2, but at least for now, they've guaranteed them a spot at the tournament. But that brings us to our bracket, our updated bracket after what we saw in the upper bracket here with the 4 teams that played over the course of this past weekend. G2 and MKOI already super far along. G2 is guaranteed finals. MKOI is guaranteed top 3. They have to go into the semifinals to take on the winner of the lower bracket gauntlet at this point, but that's what we're going to preview now. With Fnatic and Corp falling down into the lower bracket to meet Giant X and Team Heretics, we can start talking about these series and kind of previewing where I think they're going to go. First off, Fnatic taking on Giant X. Honestly, I think this is the closer of these 2 series. I wouldn't be stunned if Giant X can take a game or 2 off of Fnatic, if they can actually make this a little bit relevant, specifically because I think Noah and Joan are just on fire right now, and if Jackies can just have a good game, I think that opens up so much. But Fnatic, if they lose this, it's complete rebuild, like tear it down kind of time. I said this about Team Liquid when they moved into the lower bracket. If they can't overcome this challenge, it's like full disaster mode. Fnatic's got to win this, and I think they will, but I think that they will drop a couple of games. My prediction is actually Fnatic 3-2. I think they're going to make it interesting, maybe 3-1. They don't always struggle against the bottom tier teams, but Definitely something to keep in mind. And then K-Corp versus Heretics, I do not think this one's going to be close. I think K-Corp's going to be out for blood, and I think they're going to be moving on to the second round here. I don't think Team Heretics even picks up a game. In fact, I would be shocked if any of the games are even particularly close between these two teams. I think that there is a significant talent gap. I think that there is the potential for mid lane to just get completely out of control in favor of KC, and I would expect them to be able to dominate 3-0, but that would potentially lead into a Fnatic K-Corp matchup to try and survive and make it to the semifinals. And in that case, I think K-Corp's the better team. I think Fnatic is now, after this loss, likely to get 4th place this split, which would be a pretty big disaster. But honestly, with this roster, I'm not surprised. This is how they have played throughout the entirety of this year. But if K-Corp ends up going from 1st to 4th, that would also be a pretty big disaster. So my predictions are Fnatic, but maybe closer than people think it is. K-Corp in a dominant win, and then K-Corp being able to beat Fnatic, likely 3-1 or 3-2. But I'm going to stick with 3-1. I think K-Corp is significantly better than Fnatic. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those predictions and those takes down in the comment section below, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LEC playoffs as we always do on this channel, but we're covering all 3 of the other major region playoffs as well. So LTA North, LCK, and LPL every single week. We also cover the NACL Tier 2 over in North America, and MSI is just around the corner. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports as we get into these big international tournaments, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all